To tell the story of Kabbalah, you have to go back to the end of the 12th century, to Egypt, where you find a Jewish philosopher named Maimonides. Maimonides was heavily influenced by Aristotle. He writes a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, and in it, Maimonides harshly criticizes some aspects of Jewish tradition, calling certain practices primitive and even blasphemous. At the time, Judaism could not have welcomed this sort of criticism from one of its own. With Christianity and Islam taking over Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, the last thing rabbis needed was internal conflict. A small group of rabbis responded in defense of tradition, and their response is what became Kabbalah. They developed a system of symbolic interpretation which they could apply to plain words and objects and communicate spiritual and philosophical ideas. Through this approach, the Bible was interpreted in ways which were more consistent with the rational worldview of philosophers. And it's this dynamic, the influence of rational thinking on society challenging traditional religious ideas, that we see again several hundred years later in Enlightenment Europe, where natural philosophy is on the verge of becoming what we now call science. Starting with the so-called scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, humans were discovering more and more of the truth about the natural world. Some of what we were discovering contradicted religious doctrine or royal decree, which was a very dangerous thing to do, and some of these philosophers were imprisoned, banished, or even killed for expressing these ideas. As modern Freemasonry developed in the 17th and 18th centuries, the individuals responsible for shaping it found a way to include progressive ideas without antagonizing religious or royal authorities, which, as we know from cases like Galileo, Baruch de Spinoza, Giordano Bruno, usually had terrible consequences. In the early 18th century, while the details of modern Masonry were being formalized, these progressive ideas, freedom of religion, the importance of education, and individual liberty, were symbolically embedded into the signs and features the group adopted. Many of Masonry's symbols were, and are, biblical, reflecting the culture of the Christian Europe that produced it. So today we have a different situation with the same pressure being applied, just sort of in reverse. What I mean is our society is caught up with Masonic ideals, separation of church and state, tolerant society, consisting of equals. These are now modern popular ideas. However, ironically, Freemasonry isn't being invited to participate in the new society it helped to inspire. Why? Well, largely because the symbols it adopted a long time ago, which at the time avoided controversy for the group, have in contemporary times had the opposite effect. Undeniably, many of Freemasonry's symbols are religious in form. Saints, Holy Scripture, biblical characters, and imagery are all part of the symbolism. But it's still true that these are just symbols, and they're meant to represent today the same great truth that they privately represented to the early Freemasons. But for too many today, they don't represent anything. Some of the symbols are almost never discussed or considered by most Masons, so the symbols of Masonry are now misunderstood or not understood, even by Masons, to an unfortunate degree. Kabbalah shows how symbols which are fixed and immovable by tradition can remain meaningful, even within a worldview radically different from the one that produced them. The same approach, when applied to Freemasonry, produces rich personal meaning from symbols and ritual that many regard as a quaint collection of fables and pretend history. And that's why I wrote The Beginning is Wisdom, to introduce Masonry in a thoughtful way to those who are seeing it for the first time, as well as those who are seeing it like this for the first time.